Welcome to our coverage of the 2024 Budapest Forum, and with me now is Dorka Takácsy, a visiting fellow with the Engaging Central Europe program of the German Marshall Fund. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, you've very much looked into Russian mis- and disinformation. Let's go into Russia. What are people there being told about the war in Ukraine?
Well, the framing the Kremlin uses to talk about the war, it basically reiterates the Second World War scheme and the Second World War frames, and this is what it makes it so easy to find similarities with for everyday Russians. Because what they tell about the war is that it's basically the defense of the motherland. So basically, it's a defensive war, and that they defend themselves not only from Ukraine but predominantly from NATO. So eventually, this framing resonates very well with Russians because Russian history is full of very controversial events, and there are very little and very few events only that a whole Russian population can claim their own. And basically, the defense against the Nazi Germany is one of these. So this is why this whole framing can be filled with emotions very easily, and is so easy to feel similarities with for everyday Russians.
So when you look into this kind of content that they're putting out, is it a bit easier to understand why the Russian people might actually get behind Russia in their fight against Ukraine?
Given the fact that they live in such a bubble that it's very difficult for us to understand, because eventually, if they do not take active steps themselves and they do not use VPN on purpose, which requires certain technological consciousness, they simply will not meet any of the information that we face every single day so that we can contextualize. They do not meet any of those. So they are kept by the Kremlin in a bubble of information, and eventually based on that bubble, simply this is the logical conclusion that they kind of drew for themselves. And also given the fact that it's also a huge societal pressure on them. So if they do not align 100% with the Kremlin's narratives, they are simply claimed traitors. They are simply claimed not being patriotic enough. So eventually there are several legal consequences, for instance, to express protests, protesting sentiments and so on. But there are a lot of eventually somewhat more subtle consequences.
And so if we relate it to the everyday person, is that similar, I guess, to a social media bubble? So you only follow certain accounts, you only get certain content, and because you spend a lot of time on certain content, you end up seeing more of that content. Is that the kind of way that Russia operates in its own way to communicate to its people, and as a result, Russian people, that's all they see?
In a way, yes. And I would also add that all those set of repressive laws which were taken and which basically are already in effect since 2022, and we see more and more to come. So we see overall a more and more repressive atmosphere. Well, the preliminary goal it serves is to isolate those people who would not align with the Kremlin's narrative, so that they would feel separated, they would feel alone, they would not find any community. So eventually the whole illusion which is being created by the Kremlin suggests that everyone supports the war, all the normal people are for this war, and if you stand out, if you do not align with, then you're weird, you're a traitor, and you are alone. So basically, altogether, the creation of this illusion of being as one person behind Vladimir Putin is a very, very well thought out thing, and basically it plays on the very basic social psychological facts. People want to belong to somewhere, and they do not want to be exiled and outcast, and this is what the Kremlin plays on.
How sustainable is this kind of rhetoric, I guess, when you're trying to negotiate peace? So you have two very polar opposite psychological approaches from two different societies. So you have a Russian society that's being told a certain thing and believing a certain thing, and the West that is obviously believing a certain thing. How do you not just broker peace between, say, Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky, but actually between two societies, or is that impossible?
That is one of the most crucial questions, I think, to address. We are not there yet because we have to win the war first. But after that, it's going to be a really, really difficult task, in my opinion. But luckily, we are not the first to face this. So I think that there are going to be tremendous conclusions that we can draw and lessons to be learned from previous cases. For instance, what happened to the German society after the Second World War. We have already seen and overcome such things. So eventually, I think that we will have to look at the previous conflicts with similar societal results to see what can we do afterwards. Because indeed, the propaganda's impact and this whole propaganda machines and the Kremlin's empire's impact on Russian society, I think even though we have assessments on how tremendously and deeply it touched the Russian society, I think we cannot even imagine the depth of that.
Does someone like Vladimir Putin admit defeat, or can one of the people that he's friendlier with, perhaps a Viktor Orban, or I spoke to Finland's President Alexander Stubb, who said, look, China President Xi Jinping could pick up the phone in one call, end the war by saying to Vladimir Putin, let's retreat. Does Putin strike you as a character that can accept defeat? And if he can't, how does peace happen?
Well, of course, I don't know him personally, but based on the public image, I highly doubt it. So frankly speaking, I think that he has fallen victim for his own power vertical. Eventually, I think that this is pretty common for autocratic leaders. So if you surround yourself exclusively with people who are never going to share with you and disclose with you any information they deem unfavorable for them, and they are only going to report afterwards positive things which they do not fear the consequences of telling, well, this is a sure way to receive distorted information. And based on almost exclusively distorted information, of course, decision making is not going to work as intended. So eventually, I think that he has probably, in many cases regarding this invasion, fallen into his own trap.
Now, the nominee to be the EU's first defence commissioner, Andrius Kubilius, has been quoted as saying Vladimir Putin could be ready for confrontation with NATO and the EU in 6 to 8 years. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm not a military expert myself, but regarding Russian military capabilities, at the moment, this is not the reality now. Of course, we have to think to the future, and that is a possibility. However, I would not overestimate the possibilities for that. And the reason for that is, for instance, that we hear more and more talk by several Russian talking heads and various Kremlin figures that they basically talk all the time about possible nuclear attack, and they love to talk about it. And they do it with a strategic reason, because they know that Europe and the NATO altogether, we are afraid of anything nuclear. We do not want that to happen. And they use this fact that we are, of course, afraid, rightly so, with any possible nuclear escalation. Of course, we would like to avoid it. And they know that, and they blackmail us with it. So eventually, as long as they keep talking about it like that, I think that we have no reason to be afraid.
Can you imagine, and it's a little bit worst case scenario thinking, but can you imagine a world where Russia does take that step to escalate into, well, all-out nuclear war?
Logical reasoning would say not. So, frankly speaking, I think that as long as there is any rationale behind Putin's steps, and I think that to a certain extent he's still behaving rationally. Of course, he's also taking a lot of decisions based on distorted information, as already mentioned previously. But as long as there is a little rationale in his head, he's not going to escalate that.
Now, there's a US election in November. Depending on who's voted in, it'll either be perceived as a vote for stability in Kamala Harris or real uncertainty with Donald Trump. What type of impact do you think a Donald Trump presidency, and given his relationship with Vladimir Putin, could have on the region and the war in Ukraine?
Whoa, that's a tricky question, because frankly speaking, I'm not even sure whether Donald Trump himself knows what his strategy is going to be. So I think a lot is going to depend on who his closest people are going to be in this upcoming cycle, should there be such a thing. So altogether, what people who know him and his policies better than I do, they say that in his case, the personal factor, meaning personal grievances and so on, play probably a stronger role than they would play in Kamala Harris one. Therefore, shall he feel that his ego is threatened by something the Russians do or Vladimir Putin does, probably he can kind of take steps which are unforeseen to even himself previously. Therefore, I think that definitely a Trump presidency would bring a lot more unexpected steps and a lot more unexpected circumstances than a Harris presidency would.
How worried do you feel like the world should be when potentially the President of the US will make decisions not based on foreign affairs advice, but on his own ego being threatened?
Well, I think that this is something that we should probably somewhat be worried. I would not say we should be in panic, but we should be prepared for that, because shall he be the president, he might take steps which are probably unnegotiated with the partners, of which the partners are simply not informed by. So therefore, I think that the partners have to be aware of it, and they have to be prepared for that. That's simply this unexpectedness, unforeseeable. So being unforeseeable and taking unforeseen steps. I think that this is going to be on the table.
And coming back to your expertise in Russian myths and disinformation, I mean, even in the US, there's been Russian interference in their political processes. There's been different reports all around the world and of Europe of that happening as well. Can you talk me through a little bit about what that kind of mis and disinformation looks like and how that impacts, if you can, political processes?
Well, so Russia has its strategic goals. Russia's strategic goals, for instance, regarding the US and regarding the West, is definitely to see it as shattered, as fragmented as possible. It has many reasons. Of course, such an uncohesive group of countries which cannot act together as a properly functioning alliance system means a little threat to Russia. It means that, for instance, shall there be no cohesion between the countries, between social groups altogether, it means that such a community is simply much more defenseless to any external threat that, for instance, Russia might mean. Therefore, altogether, this is one of the goals. So to see instead of a strong alliance system, of course, Russia's strategic interest is to see it as fragmented, weak, and full of internal disputes as possible. Second of all, of course, Russia can use it for domestic reasons as well. So the Kremlin loves to portray the West being shattered, being fragmented, being basically weak and impossible to do anything. They like to represent the West like that, even when it is not like that, simply because in this case, democracy altogether is not going to be something attractive to Russians, and they will feel that, well, all right, at least our authoritarian system, led by a strongman, is functioning, it's working, it's not like that. So eventually, the weakening of the West and of the Western alliance system altogether serves, in my opinion, these two primary goals.
Dorka Takácsy, a visiting fellow with the Engaging Central Europe programme of the German Marshall Fund. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching our coverage in this interview from the 2024 Budapest Forum. Do stay with us here on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Goodbye for now.